Hey guys, and this is miicrow here. In this video, I wanted to talk about the new Flail class in terms of what the actual abilities on it are and how those trees will kind of synergize together. There's limited information about this now, but we can gain a decent amount of information from the leaked skill trees by looking at the passives, since those passives icons tend to align with other passives that were present in the past. There are two trees for the flail. There's a cleric tree and there's a bastion tree. The bastion tree I imagine will be more along the lines of tanking for allies, and the cleric tree will be more along the lines of healing for your allies. Getting into the actual abilities themselves, we could start off with the Cleric tree. The Cleric tree's first ability is Arcane Smite. This ability is an ability where you leap forward and deal strike damage with Arcane Force, which deals 130% weapon damage to all targets within 2.7 meters of the impact. It leaves behind a hazardous area at the impact point that inflicts a stack of impairment for 6 seconds to all targets that enter, and this impairment, which will be relevant for the majority of the cleric tree, does 10% arcane damage per second and inflicts a weaken, which reduces the base damage by 10%, and it has a maximum of 3 stacks. This ability also has grit, but the main thing to think about here is impairment is going to be an ability that's very similar to the Void Gauntlet's Disintegrate ability. Disintegrate is a thing that inflicts a dot that is a void-based dot instead of arcane-based dot, and inflicts a rend instead of a weaken. And both of these cap out at 30%, but weakens tend to be a lot better than rends right now because rends have had their power level decreased since the fortified changes, while weakens have remained untouched. So this has the ability to be very, very powerful within an army setting because 30% weaken is a very strong weaken that can be had on one weapon. That's like very solid. Next up, we have Arcane Vortex. Arcane Vortex is an ability where you swing the flail above the player's head and deal 4 rapid hits of 85% weapon damage in a 3-meter radius around the player. After the first spin is completed, you trigger a 3-meter blast of energy, which grants 10% in power for 5 seconds to all allies within the radius. This ability also has grit. Right there, you have two abilities that have a decent amount of grit based upon them. This Arcane Vortex hitting 4 times has the ability to potentially do a decent amount of damage if all of those connect. It's at 85% weapon damage, multiply that by 4, and you get like a decent amount of damage off of one ability. But from the actual ability itself, it doesn't look like you're going to be able to move when you cast this, so it could be used to kind of blow up a clump potentially, but I don't see it being used for other things other than that. This 10% in power is good, but I don't think is super significant, but it's still a solid weapon. We see ultimates like Firestorm that give off a 10% in power, and while they're very strong on paper, they don't tend to be played a lot. You tend to hit in power cap very easily within a PvP setting, but in a PvE setting, this ability might be a little bit better. Moving on to Arcane Eruption. This is an ability where you drag the head of your flail against the ground, causing an eruption of arcane energy in front of the player, dealing 125% weapon damage and inflicting 2 stacks of impairment for 6 seconds to all targets hit. You immediately follow up with an additional melee attack that does 160% weapon damage. Impairment deals 10% arcane damage and has that weaken, which we've already talked about before. The nice thing about this is the animation looks really, really short from the clips that I've seen, and the cooldown is very low, so this is like an easy way to get those impairment stacks up while not having to spend a long time in animation for it. It does not have grit on it though, so it's something that could be interrupted, but that impairment comes from that first attack, not the actual follow-up attack. And finally, for the cleric tree, your ultimate is Better Together, so while you're within 4 meters of one or more allies, you grant them passive healing to yourself and your allies that is heals for 16% weapon damage every 2 seconds, and that damage is exclusively scaling with focus. So if you have strength in your setup for your cleric, you're just not going to do as much. So if you're like a heavy based healer that is trying to get value out of this passive, it's not going to heal for as much because you'll have that minus 30% healing debuff on you based for the heavy class. So this is a thing that could be used for potentially light players, but the part that gets weird here is if you're a light player, I don't know if you'll be consistently within 4 meters of allies. So maybe this is a class that tries to utilize this in like a more medium setup so you're a little bit more tanky than traditional healers, and you apply utility with those weekends, but also can heal allies a decent amount. I don't see this being a very significant heal, but potentially this is like a good heal in certain situations to just to keep people topped up. Moving on to the right tree, the Bastion tree, we have Barrage. Sprint forward up to 10 meters. Upon reactivating the ability, press basic attack or reaching the end of the sprint, leap forward up to an additional 6 meters and slam the ground, dealing 30% weapon damage to targets in range of the flail during the leap and 80% weapon damage upon landing, staggering targets on impact. It is noteworthy that character collision is disabled while you're running forward with this ability, so this is probably going to be your escape ability that allows you to disengage from a clump, similar to Relentless Rush. The problem I could see with this is you could still run into ice showers, which are really common in most PvP settings, but this still could be viable as an escape ability. It looks like your best option to get out of dodge from most situations. I don't imagine this is going to be used as an engage as much, but you could potentially use it to go from like one area to a different area of the battlefield, and that could be helpful at times. Next up, we have Trip. Pretty simple ability, swing the flail forward, latching onto a target, dealing 50% weapon damage and knocking them to the ground. This looks like it kind of pulls the target in as well from the video clip, which could be decently strong to set up for other ability combos. So if you go with strength-based setup, potentially could pull a target into you, and then you could shoot them in the face with the blunderbuss, for example. Like there's combos that could be had there with that trip effect. It seems like it is a pretty easy to land and quick animation knockdown, and knockdowns are always strong in the game because freedom does not affect them. Moving on to the last Bastion ability, Warding Bludgeon. Perform a spinning leap and then swing the flail down to strike targets, dealing 100% weapon damage. While leaping, trigger a burst of energy, granting a reinforced fortify to self and all allies within 3 meters of the player, increasing armor by 50% for 8 seconds or until 3 hits are taken. This ability also has grit. That 3 hits are taken is not a very large amount, but this could be still used for like a kind of edge of objective or on the objective ability. I think this could be strong for offhand per se for a class like Sword and Shield, where you can give some allies some fortify when you're going into an engagement situation where that 50% armor will actually be useful, but that armor also could be stripped, so it will be interesting if this is useful or useless, because I don't think it's going to be too much in between. It will either be like a really strong ability or it will be like a decent ability, and I don't see it being kind of between those two. We have the ultimate for the Bastion tree, Human Shield. Hitting a target with an ability within 6 meters of an ally implies a status effect linking yourself and a single ally to each other for 5 seconds. While this effect is active, the ally will only take 50% of the incoming damage and causing you to inherit 35% of the incoming damage they didn't take. It will be interesting to see of that damage you take if it could be negated by things from your ally and yourself. So if your ally, say, is going to take 800 damage, it got mitigated before that, and if that 800 damage gets mitigated by your own like buffs, then that could be something that you don't really take that much damage for and has a really big upside. And this ultimate overall looks, I think, more strong than the left tree on paper, but it is mostly going to be used from a tanking perspective. I don't see this being super prevalent from a healer perspective, most likely. So this cleric class seems like it's like a close range to maybe medium range, a healer kind of disruptor for the battlefield that is looking to either imply weakens if you go for the left tree, or trying to set up for certain combos if you go for the right tree. The right tree seems more supplemental, like it tries to set up for other weapons to do more, versus the left tree is trying to apply some weakens and take advantage of those weakens to get value from a kind of the debuff aspect on the enemy as a whole. So overall, I would say this weapon looks super interesting. I'll show the actual cleric and uh, Bastion trees on the screen so we can kind of pick apart some of those abilities and see what some of them might mean. It looks like that towards the end of each ability tree, you're going to get access to some healing abilities because they are green. So I just imagine you're going to have to go all the way down there to finally see some of those cleric buffs. And once those get revealed, those might be the real juicers that turn this into a actual kind of healer offhand class. With that being said, I'll see you guys in the next video.